to green space. And but now we're going to see a little bit more in terms of actual data, right? You do have data?
I have some data, yes.
All right, I guess I should have asked before I actually said that. But it's always good to see that your plan is actually working, and that's a good bit of what Lauren is going to be doing. So Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
It's working? Nope. Good. Just the keyboard doesn't work. All right, so Bob already gave me an introduction.
I didn't know you were gonna...
Which I appreciate. But I'll talk a little bit more about my journey and how I got to be where I am today with bird conservation and wildlife conservation as a whole. So I received my degree from the University of Rhode Island in 2012 in wildlife and conservation biology. And it was during that time that I took my very first internship working on Cape Cod National Seashore with the Shorebird Management Department. And I took that job without ever looking at birds, looking through binoculars before even knowing what a piping plover was. And I was responsible for protecting that species. So on my very first day of the job, I went out with the lead biologist to find the first shorebird brood of the season. So these are the first hatchlings. And we kind of like army crawl over some dunes, look at a pond behind the dunes. And I hear the biologist say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, all 4 chicks are there. Do you see them? And I could not see them for the life of me. I lied and I said yes. And so for the rest of the day, I felt terrible and like such an imposter. How am I going to protect this species when I can't even see it? And so felt really crummy for the rest of the day. And then that afternoon, we're out on the beach and we saw these black-bellied plovers, and there's a pair of them in like full breeding plumage. And you can see they're pretty spectacular with that really black belly going up to the neck. And by that point, I finally figured out how to use my binoculars, and I got them on the black-bellied plovers and was just like totally blown away. So for me, the black-bellied plover was my spark bird, which is the bird that gets you excited about birds. And from then, that kind of led me on the career that I have now.
Sorry, I'm just making sure we're still trying to get in.
Oh, my bad.
It's okay.
So, and as Bob said, from there, I went to Little St. Simons Island, where I eventually conducted my master's research as well with Wilson's plovers. And then after that, took a job with North American Land Trust and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so here I am today doing my PhD research at the University of Georgia, where I am assessing bird and bat community responses to different habitat restoration techniques on the Georgia coast. And so to begin, give you a very broad background about biodiversity and biodiversity loss. It's mostly attributed to land use change, and with that being habitat loss or degradation, fragmentation, so the isolation of habitat into smaller patches. And then globally, over the last 50 years, about 75% of all terrestrial land has been modified, and 85% of wetlands have been lost. Some of the primary drivers of these changes are agriculture, forestry, and then urban development. And this isn't great. It threatens species. Some of you might be familiar with the 2019 report that came out where 3 billion birds have been lost from North American skies in the last 50 years. And that's one of the primary reasons for that is habitat loss. And then overall, globally, 25% of all species is threatened with extinction. And so without intervention, this decline will continue at a rate about 3% for the next 80 years or so. So with intervention, what can be done? Restoration, there is hope. So ecosystem restoration is the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded or destroyed, as well as conserving those ecosystems that are still intact. Preserving these ecosystems creates healthier ecosystems, which means more biodiversity, more fertile soils, and also storing carbon and other greenhouse gases as well. And Tom is not seeing the slide changes. Okay. We're figuring it out, Tom.
Go away from the extended screens. So it's not changing here. I think because, let's see. How do we change the screen that's shared to share that screen instead of this window? You know, I'm not used to using meets. Yeah. Maybe here, stop presenting. Is that just to share the screen?
Any questions?
Or is it- I think we'll try to stop presenting. Then how do you share the screen? This one, share screen. You know, they're going to do this screen. That should work. And then click on
Looks
that.
good.
Is that good?
All right, thanks, guys.
Let's try it.
All right, yeah, it's flipping through. Okay. So restoration can happen in a variety of ways, and it really depends on the goals and the objectives of those stakeholders and of the people who are on the ground implementing that restoration. So with ecosystem restoration, the UN has released the UN Ecosystem Decade of Ecosystem Restoration Report, and they predict that in the next 10 years, if you restore 350 million hectares of land, that could generate $9 trillion in ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are pretty much the direct or indirect goods from the environment that humans gain. So clean air, clean water, pollution, filtration, all of that. And you know, restoring ecosystems, both large and small, improves the environment for both wildlife, plants, and also the people who depend on them as well. So small changes can make even a big impact. And so restoration is complex, and practices that work in one ecosystem may not work in the other, depends on the scale that you're working at. And it's also not always possible to return an ecosystem to its original state. Climate change is one of the big factors with that. But research helps us to understand how to restore these ecosystems and how to get them to adapt to a changing climate, and then ultimately identify best practices to restore the planet. Sorry, this is, all right, so here we go. So for my research, I'm really focusing on how do we restore and how does this restoration affect wildlife? And I'm specifically focusing on birds and bats since they do respond well to changes in the environment. They're known as indicator species. And specifically, I'm researching the effects of restoration on two unique habitat land cover types, one being a golf course, and then the next one being the longleaf pine ecosystem. Because both of these systems, golf courses and longleaf pine, are human altered. Man has come in, modified the system, and they provide some unique challenges and opportunities for restoration. And ultimately, my goal is to evaluate the wildlife response to habitat restoration activities. And so I'm going to split this talk up into two different sections, first being the golf course side of my research, and then second being the longleaf pine side. So focus on golf course right now. To give you a very broad background about golf courses in the United States, they were first introduced in the late 1800s from Scotland to the United States. And in Scotland, golf courses, they tend to resemble the natural environment. You can see in that top corner, that's a Scottish golf course. And the term a golf link actually means coastal grassland back in the day. So Scottish golf courses were very much intertwined with the environment. That has changed since coming to the United States, where it's become very much a monoculture of turf grass. The average 18-hole golf course is about 150 acres, and there's over 16,000 golf courses in the United States alone. That accounts for over 2 million acres of land cover of golf courses strictly, which is actually more than the size of Connecticut. Yeah, there's a lot of golf. So when constructing a golf course, more than 2/3 of the natural habitat is replaced with turf grass. There's soil erosion, soil compaction. There's insecticides, fertilizers that are used. And then in the southeastern United States, one 18-hole golf course alone uses about 98,000 gallons of water per day. So there's quite a bit of water usage, fertilizers, chemicals, quite a bit of an impact on the environment with golf courses. But they also pose an opportunity as well. Studies show that there's a 30-year decline in golf courses, with about 1% of courses closing annually. And that's simply because there's more supply than demand. So golf courses are closing, which accounts for about 13,000 acres of land taken out of commission each year. So this provides a really unique opportunity for restoration to turn fairways back into native grasslands. And also, golf courses can support wildlife when its habitat is intentionally managed for wildlife. Studies have found that moderately disturbed cover types, such as golf courses, are found more bird species richness and biomass than strictly natural versus urban areas. And this is positive because it shows that large-scale restoration projects on golf courses is predicted to have positive effects on the wildlife community. And so there have been previous golf course conversions in the past back to nature, but these courses did not formally monitor the wildlife. So this is expected to be the first study to examine the effects of large-scale golf course conversion on the bird and bat community. So my objective for this golf course research is to assess how the bird and the bat community responds to the conversion of a closed golf course to native coastal grasslands. Specifically, I'm asking, how does golf course restoration change bird and bat occupancy? So essentially presence and absence, species richness, the amount of different species that are there, abundance and diversity. And then also, does the bird community composition shift towards a higher species richness of those associated with grassland habitats versus more generalist species? So here we are, working on Jekyll Island, Georgia, which is right down the road from here. As many of you know, it's a state park. There's about 6,000 acres, and only about a third of the island is developed. The rest of it is maintained as natural area. And so for the golf course restoration project, it's located on the former Oleander course, which is located in that southwestern corner of the Jekyll Island Golf Club. So the Oleander course was built in 1910, and a decision was made a few years ago to close the course due to drainage and infrastructure issues. It just made it too expensive to maintain and keep open. So the course was formally closed in November of 2024. Turf grass treatments to remove the turf grass started in spring of 2025. And then native plant restoration began this past fall, right? In October, yeah, just a few weeks ago. So Jekyll Island is now getting native wildflowers and grasses on the ground. And overall, it's about 52 acres on the restoration site of turf grass, and then there's some pine oak forest patches mixed in with that as well. And so the restoration site is going to broadly resemble a maritime grassland community. Some of you might be familiar with the pink muley grass, which is a very characteristic species of this habitat type. Sorry, this clicker is a little funky. There we go. Yeah, the maritime grassland was once widespread across the Southeast, which is now limited due to succession and, wax murals tending to come in and take over. But some regionally important species depend on these grasslands, such as the painted bunting and some other species as well. So I started collecting data 2 years ago, So I'm collecting data in both the summertime and the wintertime to collect breeding and non-breeding season data. In 2024, I collected data on the course while it was open and active and still open for play. So I was doing my wildlife surveys while there were golfers on the course. So try not to get hit by golf balls. In 2025, I sampled while the course was still closed in that pre-restoration phase, so before native plants had become established. And then I also added a control site as well. So I started collecting data on the courses that are open just to the north of Oleander, so I can have something to compare my data to. And then next year, I'm going to also collect data in that post-restoration phase. So after the course has had the native plants established, and I'll continue collecting data on that control site too. Here we go. So this is the course after it had closed, but before native plants had become established. This was taken in May of this past year. And you can see this is actually some native species that had naturally started to grow up on their own. It's a mix of like fernweed and dog fennel. So some like weedy species, but still native species that had come back naturally. But all of this on the fairways is going to be converted to native grasses and wildflowers. And then you can kind of see in the top right corner too, Jekyll Island, they do prescribe burning on the island too to open up that understory and the pines and the oaks as well, which is why the trees are a little bit charred. But it's kind of amazing to see just how well the native species started to come back and the limited amount of turf grass that's actually still there.
Lauren?
Yeah.
The picture before this one, what had been done to the golf course at that point?
That was taken in December of this last year, so the course was closed.
Okay.
And then this was post-burn as well,
Okay.
which is why it looks a little bit charred.
So it had been burned.
Mhm.
And they turned off irrigation.
Yes,
And then did they scrape everything off the top?
Yeah, they did in some areas.
Some
They
area,
had the mechanical scrapers that drove up the turf at the greens.
so how am I collecting data? I am using acoustic recording units, otherwise called ARUs. If you see that later in my talk, that's what I'm referring to. And for birds, I'm using the Wildlife Acoustics Song Meter Mini 2, which is on that right-hand side. And so these were set to record 2 hours around dawn and 2 hours around dusk daily. So I collected 4 hours of bird audio data per day. And then I also paired this with point counts too. So I did 3 point count surveys each season at each ARU station. And then for the bats, I used SM4 ultrasonic recorders with omnidirectional mics. This is the bat recorder on the left-hand side. And you can see the microphone is about 10 feet off the ground using that extended painter's pole. And since it's an omnidirectional mic, it's able to detect bats in a 360 motion, which is why it's so high above the ground. And for the bat mics, they were recording from sunset to sunrise. And so I have a lot of recordings, a lot of data, and I can't listen to that all by myself. So I use technology to help me. So for the birds, I'm using a BirdNet Analyzer, and then for the bats, I'm using the software program Kaleidoscope Pro. And both of these programs, it's essentially pattern matching. So a spectrogram is a visual representation of sound. So every species, every bird call, bat vocalization has a unique pattern when it's shown visually. And so what these programs do is just match the species with those patterns. So does anyone know what the bird in the top right corner is?
Morning.
Chickadee.
Bachman sparrow.
That is so, now, is that from Jekyll?
That is from Salem Wildlife Management
Wow,
Area. Yeah.
so cool. Nice.
No, not Jekyll. And then the bottom. This is a trick question.
No, it's not.
It's a bat, yes. This is a northern yellow bat. So for the wavelengths, you can kind of, it's tough to see on the axis on the left-hand side. But for the Bachman sparrow, it's vocalizing between about like 3 and 7 kilohertz. And for the bats, it's between 20 and 40,000 kilohertz, so very high frequency. And also, I'm not going to get into the details about like my specific parameters. If you want to ask me questions about that, let's talk afterwards, but it was a process, let's just say that. All right, and so for the birds, I divided the bird community into different community habitat associations based on pretty much their life history. So for your generalist species, these are typically your backyard birds like your cardinals. Your forest birds are your forest interior species, such as your wood thrushes, eastern wood peewees. Open and early successional species are those birds found in fields, grasslands, edges, shrubs, eastern bluebirds, for example. Wetland and aquatic species are your water birds and your shorebirds. Can also be like Acadian flycatchers too, which typically are found in riparian areas. For pine savanna species, these are your open pine woodland specialists, such as the brown-headed nuthatch, which is endemic to southeastern pine forests. And then finally, I have a category just for birds that were migrating through the study site and just stopping over to breed on their way to their breeding grounds, which accounts for many of the warbler species, such as that black-throated blue. All right, here we go. All right, so for birds, this is the summer of 2024, while the course was still open and active for play. And overall, 72 bird species were detected on the oleander restoration site. The forest and the generalist bird species occupied the largest proportion of the bird community at about 56%. But also there are moderate amounts of water birds documented on the site as well. And this goes to show that there's moderate amounts of water available on the golf course. Oleander is right next to Oleander Big Pond. So there is quite a bit of water bird species that use the pond and then the adjacent habitat edges too. For bats in the summer of 2024, while the course was still open, 8 species were detected. The most active species, I should say, were red and Seminole bats and tricolored bats. And then I grouped red and Seminole bats together because their calls are so similar and they're kind of hard to distinguish with the software program. And these 2 species accounted for 82% of all the activity. But there were also moderate amounts of evening and southeastern bats. And only 3 species of all the species that could be potentially occurring on the charcoal site were not detected during that summer. In the winter of 2024, after the course had closed and gone fallow, 54 species were detected across all of the ARU sites. This is typical. There's fewer birds in the wintertime, so that's to be expected. But overall, the community composition was similar between the summer and the wintertime, with both those general species and the forest species taking up the majority of the bird community. And then for bats in the wintertime, 9 species were reported, so 1 more than the summertime. Overall, there were fewer detections in the winter. Again, it's colder, bats are not as active, but there tended to be a seasonal shift between summer and winter, with 3 species accounting for 82% of all that activity, but that being the tricolored bat, the Brazilian free-tailed bat, and then the red and Seminole bat. And the Brazilian free-tailed bat actually had over a 2,000% increase in their activity levels between the summertime and the wintertime on the golf course.
Do you have anything to describe that? Like, what is that?
You know, bats do have different habitat preferences between breeding season and non-breeding season. So it's possible that they just kind of moved around depending on their seasonal shifts. But that's something that I'm looking to explore because it is interesting, right?
Is it also possible they vocalize less during 1 to 2?
Yeah, that too. Yeah. And only 2 species were not detected. And then the 1 species that was detected in the wintertime, but not the summertime, was the big brown bat. All right, so this past summer, when I had my new control site, and also after the course had closed, So the oleander restoration site had 66 species detected, while the control site had 69 species detected. So over a pretty similar comparison. And also the community structure was very similar with those early successional species, forest species, and then general species taking up the majority of the community. And then for bats, again, tricolored and red and seminole bats were both dominant at both sites. Same 3 species that were not detected last summer were not detected this summer. But overall, if you kind of look, might be a little bit tough to see here, but oleander had fewer detections overall. So most of the activity was on that control sites. And both sites had an equal number of bat recorders set up. So theoretically, there just happens to be more bat activity on that control site versus oleander right now. So some of the preliminary patterns that we're seeing, again, this is very preliminary data. So across all these data collection periods, forest and generalist bird species make up the largest proportion of the bird community, followed by those open and early successional species. The community composition stays stable year-round. And I also just want to point out that the most vocal species is not the most abundant species. Yeah, definitely, you cannot determine bird abundance with the ARUs. You can simply just get presence or absence. And that's why I'm using the point count data to get a look at the abundance of some of these species. But for some of you who might know, Chuckles widow, which is a declining species in the southeastern United States right now, they were the most vocal species at the study site. The number of hits is the number of times that it was recorded calling with the recorder, and I had 250,000 detections for this species. So if you equate the amount of times that it was detected at the site, you might mistaken it thinking that it's doing very, very well, which it's not. They're just very chatty. And so for the bats, both the red and seminole and the tricolor bats were consistently dominant at both the control site and the oleander restoration site. And these are both tree roosting species. So it's, potentially the pine and the oaks buffering these golf course habitat, buffering the golf courses, are providing habitat for these species to roost in. There we go. But also multiple other bat species were detected on these courses too, with moderate to low activity rates. So there's quite a bit of habitat heterogeneity. So there's various types of habitats on the golf course between the water features, the pines, the oaks, the open habitat, some of the native grasses that's planted. That's all providing habitat for a variety of bat species. So I'm still collecting more data, and I predict that, obviously these habitat features, the structure is going to change over these next sampling periods. So in the next 1 to 2 years, I predict that the forest and the wetland species abundance will stabilize, while early successional species will increase, such as indigo buntings and yellow-breasted chats. I think that the bat species richness and activity will be consistent with some of the baseline data that I collected. And then in the moderate to long term, pine savanna species and open habitat species, such as field sparrows, potentially Henslow sparrows, are going to increase. And I think we'll see an increase in bat activity on that restoration site as it begins to have native plants established as well.
Lauren,
Mhm.
what's an early successional species?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have explained that. So an early successional species is a species found in like grasslands or edges. When you go in and kind of mow an area, grasses are essentially what comes back first. So it's really the vegetation that comes back first after a disturbance event. So grasses, some wax myrtles, some of that like shrub sort of habitat. Yeah. No, good question. And so for this data, I think the results could potentially stimulate and guide the restoration of golf courses throughout the Southeast. And these restored courses could serve as stepping stones or corridors that connect fragmented landscapes. And this data could guide best management practices for restoring or enhancing habitat on active golf courses as well for a multitude of species. And now I'm going to shift from golf courses to the longleaf pine ecosystem. Anyone have any questions about golf courses right now? Yes,
The bats migrate
they do migrate. Yeah.
how far?
It depends on the species. I mean, some of it can be rather long distance. But that's a good question. Talking with Trina Morris, who's the Georgia DNR bat biologist, they have very limited data on wintering bats in coastal Georgia as well. So I'm hoping that some of my research will start answering some of those questions too. But that's a good question. I don't have all of the answers for that, but they do migrate.
And how about owls? You get much data on owls?
I have collected some owl ARU data. Bright horned owls and barred owls, eastern screech have been recorded at the sites. But yeah, the nightjars, the chuckles, widows are quite vocal.
How accurate is the ARU thing that you use?
So fairly, it depends on that question. They're very sensitive, so they do detect quite a bit in the soundscape. I set them up 250 meters apart from one another because I don't want to be able to detect species from on one recorder and another recorder. But when it comes to analyzing the recordings in the software program, that's where it gets a little bit tricky and you can get false positives and false negatives. So it's really important to go through and check your data. But you do pick up quite a bit.
Is that essentially using the same kind of technology that Merlin?
It is, yeah. It's if you ever use Merlin and kind of looked at the soundscape that shows up, that's what it is. You can just throw in a bunch of files into it instead and it outputs that. So.
Do you have any, like, on your hypothesis, like any anticipated species that would be brought back in the, like, for example, wood storks? I think that the pond areas are great nesting areas, and they haven't typically been there.
Yeah, and that's, they are doing like some wetland restoration up at that pond as well. They put in some nesting platforms. Have wood storks returned? I thought they were already nesting out there.
They're not nesting there
Okay.
yet, but we've got the platforms and now there's islands around it to help protect those nests.
Yeah. But there are some species, potentially some like Henslow sparrows might be able to go move in with those grassland habitat types. Yeah, I'm excited to see what eventually comes back.
And did you guys, when you're putting this native grasses or species back, did you anticipate what might bring as far as birds and bats?
Yeah,
So we're trying to recreate some of that rare habitat, like the maritime grassland that you were talking about. So yeah, a lot of it is going to be longleaf pine savanna as well as wiregrass habitat and sweetgrass habitat. That's a lot of what it is. And then we'll leave some of the forested areas forested, but we're working right now to knock out as many of the invasives as we can in there and do more burning operations to kind of keep the understory clear.
So with the data, well, how are you guys using the data to decide what kind of management you're going to do? Like, how does it influence?
Yeah, that's good. And it might be better if I talk about the longleaf pine first and then get your
you're
question.
that makes sense.
All right, any other questions, golf course questions before I move on? All right, change over to longleaf pine. So the longleaf pine ecosystem, it's essentially a grassland with some scattered trees mixed in. The longleaf pine habitat tends to have a diverse ground cover of wiregrass, legumes, wildflowers, low shrubs like blueberries, and it's very highly diverse. One study found that there's over 40 plants per square meter in one of the plots that they were surveying. So it's one of the most diverse communities outside of the tropics in North America. But it historically covered 90 million acres, and now today less than 5% of that remains. And primarily agriculture, pine plantations, development, tree harvest, and fire suppression has led to the demise of the longleaf pine ecosystem. And this is a system that depends on forest fires for its survival. So 35% of all bird species, 70% of all mammal species forage on the ground. So they really need that fire to be able to come in and open up that understory and allow that herbaceous understory to fully develop for it to have foraging habitat. And there's numerous longleaf pine endemic species, so species that are only found in the longleaf pine forest, such as red cockaded woodpeckers, and then Bachman sparrows are one of those pine specialists as well. And so America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative has a goal of increasing the amount of longleaf pine habitat to 8 million acres. In order to reach that goal, 3 million more acres is needed. So in order to do this, restoration is crucial. So this part of my goal is to assess how the bird and the bat community responds to various longleaf pine ecosystem practices, restoration practices, and the time since initial restoration activity began. Specifically, I'm asking is, does a particular restoration technique increase the occupancy, so presence of longleaf pine specialist species in an area? And then how long does it take for these community shifts to happen for a particular restoration prescription? And is that prescription more effective? So I'm still working on the Georgia coast for this part of my research, working at Altama Wildlife Management Area and Ceylon Wildlife Management Area, which are both public lands managed by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. Altama is about 4,000 acres in size. Georgia DNR acquired this property in 2015. And the area tends to hold a lot of moisture, so it's a little bit mesic, and that's what that word means. And because of that, there tends to resemble a longleaf pine flatwood where you have more saw palmetto in the understory versus wiregrass. Ceylon Wildlife Management Area is about 27,000 acres, so it's substantially larger than Altama. Georgia DNR acquired this property in 2021. And the site is drier than Altama, so you have more wiregrass in that understory versus saw palmetto. Some of the restoration prescriptions that Georgia DNR is putting on the ground is prescribed burns, timber thinning, clear cutting for invasive species, mulching, and then also planting longleaf and clear cuts, and then also in the understory of existing longleaf pine canopies as well. So again, all of this is to open up that mid layer and the understory layer, so to keep it open and allow sunlight to come through. And so for this, I'm using a different type of recorder for this part of my research. I'm using Titley scientific rangers, and these have the capability of recording both birds and bats at the same time, so I don't need two different recorders to do this. And you can see right on the front of the recorder is the bat mic, on the side is the bird mic. And so I use a stratified random sampling design. So I randomized where I put these sites depending on the time since DNR started restoration activity, and also the different restoration prescriptions that they prescribe. So again, timber thinning, burning, so on and so forth. Again, I did avian point counts at each of these sites. I took habitat measurements as well. And then same sampling period as the Jekyll Island work. I'm sampling in the summertime and also the wintertime. And using the same analytical methods for the BirdNet analyzer and the kaleidoscope to process these recordings. Don't really need to get into that again. And so for this, I started collecting data just this last summer. I haven't been able to go through all of my data yet, so for the longleaf pine research, I'm just showing you a subset of the bird data without the bat data yet. So here we are. So for Altama Wildlife Management Area, 59 bird species were recorded, and at Ceylon, 55 bird species were recorded. At both sites, forest and then those open and early successional species were the most prevalent. And then one thing to note is that Bachman sparrows and yellow-breasted chats were only recorded at Ceylon Wildlife Management Area. They were not detected at Altama. So for looking at the time since DNR started that initial restoration, And again, they purchased the property in 2021 and 2015 for the two sites. Overall, the community structure is similar across all of these time periods, with peak species abundance occurring in that 3 to 5 year category, right in the center here, with 60 species. Yeah, that's all the time. So looking at specific species with time since initial restoration, Bachman sparrows tend to prefer longer managed stands. And at Ceylon, we did not have any over 7 year plots at Ceylon like we did at Altama. Unfortunately, we just don't know what the management was at these wildlife management areas before Georgia DNR purchased these properties. So I can only use the data that's given to me at this point. But anyway, Bachman sparrows prefer longer managed pine forest stands, so areas that have been burned more regularly. Forest birds prefer older managed stands as well. And then open and early successional species prefer stands that have some moderate amounts of restoration timing, so in that 3 to 5 year category. And these include eastern towhees and indigo buntings. Looking at how timber management has impacted some of these birds. On the left-hand side, I have unthinned property, unthinned stands that were thinned by Georgia DNR, and then stands that were thinned before DNR acquired the property. So more species were detected in thin stands, but there tends to be an even distribution of community types across all of these treatments. And looking at Bachman sparrows again, there's a strong presence in older thin stands, and these are a flagship species for that pine savanna habitat. For brown-headed nuthatches, again, a strong presence in older thin stands, but they will also occur in unthinned stands as well. And northern bobwhites, they respond well to thinning really at any stage. Just so long as the area is thin, they're happy to be there. And then for yellow-breasted chats, they respond well to recently thinned areas. And these are also an early successional poster child species. Again, talking about early successional species, they really like that area that had just been disturbed and had not really had the chance to grow up and mature yet. And now looking at longleaf pine plantings. So this data includes both clear-cut and understory plantings. Forest interior species, such as eastern wood pewees and wood thrushes, they're less likely to occupy clear cuts, kind of makes sense, and replanted areas. Oh man, here we go. All right, so some of the preliminary patterns that we're seeing. Pine savanna species respond positively to thinning, peaking at moderate amounts of intermediate stages of management. Early successional species, again, like bluebirds, thrive at moderate amounts, but decline as the stand matures. And then for forest birds, they tend to show a lag in response to management and are only found in older managed stands. And there tends to be a community composition shift with time since initial restoration began. So some of my predictions with this research is, I think that overall species richness will remain stable, but community structure will shift. Also, I think early successional species will decline without timber management. So forest management is very important to maintain habitat for some of these species, especially those pine savanna specialists. And those primarily occur in those older managed stands. So the amount of times that an area has been burned, the frequency of it is very important for those species, which are priorities for conservation. And though they don't occur there now, I think in the very near future, Bachman sparrows will occupy Alchem. Yes, I'm manifesting that and putting that energy out in the world. The habitat's there, it's great. They're just, they'll be there soon. Looking at some of the broader impacts of this research, I think it's going to improve, this will improve avian habitat at a regional scale, ultimately supporting bird populations. It fills knowledge gaps for priority species, such as the northern bobwhite, which is an important game bird in the state of Georgia and the Southeast. And ultimately, this leads to data-informed restoration decision-making and helps support Georgia DNR to effectively restore quality longleaf for wildlife on their public lands. So looking at what I'm doing next, I'm continuing with data collection and analysis. I have 2 more winter sampling periods. I'll be back down on the coast next month to start my next winter sampling data collection. And then I have 1 more field season for the breeding season in summer of 2026, starting in April. And so I'm going to be using the data that I collect to build out occupancy and abundance models for some of those priority species. And that will help me, look at the different restoration prescriptions and figure out what restoration prescriptions work best for those species. And again, for bats too, I didn't really talk about bats with my longleaf pine work. I still need to go through all that data, but I will. And then also I'm kind of looking at how to turn this research into a long-term monitoring project as well. For the scope of my PhD work, I'm only collecting data for 3 years. It'd be great to have someone else work on this project after me and get a long-term monitoring project going as well. So with that, I'd like to thank my supporting funding, UGA, the Warnell School, Forestry Natural Resources, Georgia DNR, Georgia Ornithological Society, American Ornithological Society, Jekyll Island Authority, and Wildlife Acoustics. And I will take questions. My voice. Yeah, Elliot.
That's gonna get really exciting. Let's switch back to the golf courses
Yeah.
for a second though. So, Jekyll presents a unique opportunity, right? Because it's like a state park and there happens to be this golf course. Decommissioned, and we have this opportunity to do this. What motivating factor is there to carry that forward? Like other for-profit golf courses or obviously golf courses, is there work being done to market this to other golf courses in the world?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I wanted to study this for my PhD, a few years ago, I worked on a management plan for a closed golf course in Virginia. And so they decided again to close the course because it was just too expensive to maintain, but they wanted to keep the course as a community amenity, but also have it benefit wildlife and the ecosystem, but also have it be public trails too. So I could see a lot of private courses doing that in the future where they just can't maintain the cost of using all the water, all the fertilizers in the future, but wanting to still have that land be open and keep that green space and that tradition alive, but have it be repurposed for another reason too. Yeah.
I'll just put a plug in too, back to the Coastal Science Symposium. Sea Palms West on St. Simons is one of those where we have students who have been monitoring the aquatic habitats. They'll be presenting some of the data. It's a very different model in terms of quote unquote restoration, but it's a golf course that apparently a lot of these golf courses are being closed and used for different purposes.
Yeah.
A lot of opportunities.
Yeah, and so for part of my first chapter too, I'm looking at land cover of golf courses across the United States and how that impacts biodiversity at a national level. Yeah, and it's just amazing going through the data and the amount of golf courses that have closed over time and how we can repurpose that land for something better.
I think there are eight golf courses on St. Simons.
Yeah.
Between St. Simons and Seattle, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's just more supply than demand.
Well, I'm not very familiar with bats, but I know there are some species that are impacted by white nose disease or syndrome when they're roosting in caves in Georgia, but then some of those populations or species can use coastal forests and sites as kind of refuges. Are there any of those species that you're targeting or might be kind of candidates for these habitats?
Yeah, some of those species are. In fact, let me go to my list. It's gone.
I can put you back on duplicate mode.
Yeah, thank you. But to answer your question, yes. So white nose syndrome, it's a fungal disease that affects bats when they're roosting in colonies. When they get so clustered together, the fungus spreads more quickly among the bats clustered together in that hypodaculum. So some of the bat species that, do occur in the Georgia coast are the same species being affected by white nose, but because they have very different roosting strategies, they're not so tightly knit and those big roosting groups, white nose is not affecting creek roosting species in the way that they are affecting cave roosting species. But most bat species are priorities for conservation because of white nose syndrome and just the severe declines that they've gone through. Where am I? But northern yellow bats, that's a species that's kind of unique to the area. They roost in Spanish moss as well instead of trees. So that's one of the species that is not affected by white nose. There we go.
Might we see bats if we look in Spanish moss?
You might, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, dig around in there.
Are any of those bat species federally listed?
Proposed, I'm trying to think which, the Southeastern U.S was proposed candidate, right, recently? Is a candidate species? Eesh. I'm not sure where that stands right now. And then, there's other proposed species as well. Like the Indiana bats, currently on the endangered species list, but that's not one of the species that could be potentially found on the Georgia coast right now. Yeah. Yeah, Dan.
Thinking about the long-term monitoring that you mentioned, obviously restoration at the site's going to be an ongoing process and isn't going to be done. I don't know when you define done on restoration sometimes, but certainly not while you're still probably doing your PhD, at least hopefully. So have you thought of anything that would allow for long-term monitoring without having to have like PhD student on the island constantly?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the beauty of the recording units too. You can just kind of set them up and essentially forget about them. The batteries.
Sounds like there's a bit of work involved.
No, I mean, just at the beginning of the field season with setting them up. And the batteries last for the whole field season. So do the SD cards. They're really easy and user friendly to set up. So if anyone else has any of the monitoring that they want to do, just set some acoustic recorders up. You can leave them out there for a month or two, and then go back and run your data through that analysis program and have it do it for you.
To your point about like pairing that with point counts, their role for citizen science, so like diverse community to help with that monitoring.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the ARUs, I'm using that to help me identify presence and absence for the bird community as a whole. For the point counts, that helps me determine abundance of some of these species. So again, two different methods that help me with very different results. But yeah, if anyone wants to come out and help me with point count surveys, that would be great. I need some more bodies.
We might be able to help with that.
Yeah,
Could be facilitated.
yeah, that'd be great. I do need help.
This is kind of a question for the room, but has anybody here been involved in or managed or anything like a citizen science group with bird identification or anything like that? Because that's kind of where my head goes with stuff like this is like, can we get people to help collect this data because it's so much data?
Because
There's also a challenge with citizen science data.
There's a breeding bird survey done nationwide in this brain. And it's done the same way with point counts on a specific thing in there. And so there's a network of people who do that.
Are you talking about something done through like?
It's
I guess I'm wondering the process of quality control of that data.
Yeah.
Is what I'm
Yeah.
kind of getting at. Like if it takes a whole team of people to do
I've seen if
that,
there's any chats,
that might be a challenge.
questions in the chat, but I don't see any.
You kind of have to go through a sort of a little review in order to be by the people that run the survey, in order to say, okay, yeah, you can do this well.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Well, Lauren, thank you.
Oh, one guy, well, this kind of, one, it's maybe a little slightly off topic, but I wondered, is, you know, or has there been any discussion of, red-cockaded woodpeckers being reintroduced like in Ceylon? Is that
You would have to get Georgia DNR to give you the. There has been talks about it, yeah, but I don't know if they have a time frame for that, or Or funding, yeah.
It's certainly big enough, but is it
oh, absolutely. Like Ceylon has some of the nicest longleaf pine wiregrass community I've ever seen, and they have trees already marked for nesting cavities for red-cockaded woodpeckers. So it's only a matter of time before, they come back. But I think the closest population to Ceylon is the Okefenokee. So, they might be able to disperse and find Ceylon, they might not.
That's not very far.
Yeah, but Georgia DNR might need to bring them in. Oh, here's the window. Sarah says, yes, they installed artificial cavities.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll keep an eye out for emails from us. And remember about the December 6th field trip. And we'll have a Christmas party coming up in December. We haven't scheduled that yet, but we'll let you know when we do. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody online. We're closing out.